The rain lashed against the diner's windows as Maggie wiped the counter, her thoughts heavy with worry. The bell above the door jingled, startling her. An old man stepped in, drenched and weary. "I don't have much," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers. "But I could really use a meal." Something in his voice made her pause. She didn't know it yet, but this stranger, and the note he'd leave behind, would change her life forever. Consider liking and subscribing to support the channel. Comment what you think will happen next. Maggie Thompson stood behind the counter of her small diner, the one she had run for the last 15 years. It was early morning, and the smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but the usual warmth she felt when starting the day was absent. Business had been slow for months, and the bills were piling up faster than she could keep track of. The diner had once been the heart of the town, bustling with regulars and travelers alike. Now, more often than not, Maggie found herself standing behind the counter, wiping it down unnecessarily just to keep her hands busy. She had tried everything to bring customers back through the doors, specials, discounts, even live music on Friday nights, but nothing seemed to work. The economy in their small town had taken a downturn, and people were saving wherever they could. Eating out had become a luxury that fewer and fewer could afford. Maggie understood this, but it didn't make things any easier. She had poured her heart and soul into this diner. It was more than a business. It was her life's work, the one thing that had kept her going after her husband passed away 5 years ago. Today felt particularly quiet. The regulars who usually trickled in for their morning coffee hadn't shown up, and Maggie's thoughts kept returning to the stack of unpaid invoices sitting in the back office. She could practically hear the ticking of the clock, reminding her that time was running out. The thought of closing the diner crossed her mind more often than she cared to admit, but she couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. Not yet. The sound of the bell over the door caught her attention, and Maggie looked up to see an old man shuffling in. He was a stranger, someone she had never seen before, and in a town like this, new faces were rare. He wore a worn-out jacket, the kind that looked like it had seen better days, and his hands were shaking slightly as he took off his hat and placed it on the counter. His face was etched with lines of age, and his eyes held a weariness that Maggie recognized all too well. "Morning," the man greeted her in a raspy voice as he sat down at the counter. "Morning," Maggie replied, forcing a smile. "What can I get you?" The man hesitated, glancing at the menu on the wall, then at the tip jar that sat nearly empty beside the register. "I don't have much," he admitted quietly, "but I could really use a cup of coffee." Maggie's heart tightened. She had seen this before, too many times lately. People coming in, hoping for something warm to fill their stomachs, but not able to afford much. Normally, she would have been more cautious, knowing she couldn't keep giving things away for free. But there was something about this man, something in the way he held himself, that made her want to help. Maybe it was the weight of her own struggles reflected in his tired eyes. "I've got you covered," she said gently, pouring him a cup of coffee. "And how about some breakfast? I make a pretty good bacon and eggs." The man's face softened with surprise. "I don't want to impose," he murmured. "You're not imposing," Maggie assured him, already cracking eggs onto the griddle. "Everyone needs a good meal every now and then." He didn't argue further, and as she prepared his breakfast, Maggie found herself thinking about all the times her regulars had helped her through tough spots. People in this town had looked out for one another for as long as she could remember, and even though things were hard now, that didn't mean she couldn't offer a little kindness when it was needed. When she set the plate in front of him, the old man looked at her with a gratitude that went beyond words. "Thank you," he said simply. Maggie nodded, brushing off the thanks with a wave of her hand, but deep down, she felt a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. For the next half hour, she went about her work as the man quietly ate his meal. He didn't speak much, only offering a few comments about the weather and how good the food was. When he finished, he carefully placed his fork down and wiped his mouth with a napkin. "I wish I could pay you," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a few crumpled dollar bills. "But this is all I've got." Maggie shook her head. "Don't worry about it. You take care of yourself, okay?" The man looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as if he were trying to find the right words. Finally, he nodded and stood up, placing his hat back on his head. "You've done a good thing today," he said quietly. "More than you know." Maggie smiled, but before she could respond, the man was already heading for the door. As the bell rang behind him, she felt a pang of sadness. She didn't know why, but something about the encounter left her feeling unsettled. It wasn't until later that afternoon, after the lunch rush, which consisted of just a handful of customers, when Maggie found the note. It was tucked under the napkin where the old man had sat. She hadn't noticed it before, but now as she cleaned up, the small piece of paper caught her eye. Unfolding it, she read the words written in shaky handwriting. "Thank you for your kindness. The world needs more people like you. Don't give up. Something good is coming your way. I can feel it. Keep the faith." Maggie stared at the note, her heart pounding in her chest. The words were simple, but they hit her like a bolt of lightning. She had been so close to giving up, so close to walking away from the diner and everything she had worked for. But this note, this small gesture from a stranger, filled her with a hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Tears welled in her eyes as she carefully folded the note and slipped it into her apron pocket. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe the old man had seen something in her that she hadn't been able to see herself. Either way, his words stayed with her for the rest of the day, echoing in her mind as she went about her work. For the first time in weeks, Maggie felt a glimmer of optimism. She didn't know what was coming or how things would turn around, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't ready to give up just yet. The diner meant too much to her, and there were still people who needed a place like this, a place where they could come and feel at home. Over the next few days, Maggie kept the note with her, reading it whenever she felt the weight of her worries pressing down on her. She started to notice little changes, a few more customers trickling in, a couple of new faces joining the regulars. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. Weeks passed, and slowly but surely, the diner began to come back to life. Maggie worked harder than ever, but this time she didn't feel so alone. The community seemed to rally around her, and more people started showing up, drawn by the warmth and comfort that the diner offered. Word spread, and soon Maggie found herself busier than she had been in years. It wasn't just the business that had changed, it was Maggie herself. She carried that note with her everywhere, a reminder of the power of kindness and the strength of hope. Whenever she felt overwhelmed or uncertain, she would take it out and read the old man's words, feeling a renewed sense of purpose each time. The diner wasn't just surviving anymore, it was thriving. And Maggie knew, deep down, that the old man's note had played a part in that. He had seen something in her, something she hadn't been able to see in herself. His words had reminded her of the importance of holding on, even when things seemed impossible. Years later, long after the diner had become a beloved staple in the town once again, Maggie still thought about the old man. She never saw him again, but she often wondered where he had come from and what had led him to her diner that day. In some ways, it didn't matter. What mattered was the message he had left behind, a message that had changed her life in ways she never could have imagined. Maggie had once thought that saving the diner was about saving her business, but in the end, it was about something much bigger. It was about finding hope when everything seemed lost, about believing in the kindness of strangers, and about never giving up, no matter how hard things got. And so she continued to run the diner with the same love and care she always had, knowing that sometimes the smallest gestures can make the biggest difference. As the years went on, Maggie's life began to intertwine more deeply with the people in her town. The diner became more than just a place to grab a meal. It became a safe haven for those in need, a gathering spot for friends, and even a source of comfort for those passing through. The walls, once adorned with faded pictures of the diner's early days, were now filled with photos of the people who made it special: customers, employees, and friends who had come to mean everything to Maggie. One day, a young woman named Claire came into the diner. She was carrying a battered suitcase, her face etched with exhaustion and a hint of desperation. Maggie recognized that look. It was the same one she had seen in the old man all those years ago. Claire hesitated at the door, glancing around as if unsure whether she should stay or go. Maggie caught her eye and gave her the warmest smile she could muster. "Come on in, sweetheart," Maggie called out. "Take a seat. You look like you could use a good meal." Claire's shoulders relaxed, and she made her way to a booth by the window. Maggie brought her cup of coffee and sat down across from her, a gesture she rarely made unless she felt someone needed it. "Rough day?" Maggie asked gently. Claire nodded, her eyes filling with tears she was clearly trying to hold back. "Rough few months," she admitted. "I've been trying to find work, but, well, it hasn't been easy. I'm starting to think I made a mistake coming here." Maggie reached out and placed a comforting hand on Claire's. "I know what that feels like," she said softly. But trust me, sometimes the hardest times lead to the best places. You just have to hang in there." Claire's lip trembled, but she nodded, clinging to Maggie's words as if they were a lifeline. Maggie didn't charge her for the meal that day, knowing from experience how much even a small act of kindness could mean. Over the weeks that followed, Claire became a regular at the diner, and Maggie watched as the young woman began to find her footing. She got a job at a nearby store, and her visits to the diner became less about desperation and more about friendship. Maggie saw herself in Claire, just as she had seen herself in the old man. It reminded her of how interconnected people's lives could be, how an act of kindness could ripple out in ways you couldn't predict. She began to make it a point to pay attention, to notice the people who came through her doors, and to find ways to help, even in small ways. Sometimes it was a warm meal for someone who couldn't afford it. Other times, it was a listening ear or a piece of advice that came from her own hard-earned wisdom. One winter evening, long after the dinner rush had ended, Maggie sat at the counter with a cup of tea, reflecting on how much her life had changed since that fateful day with the old man. The note he had left her was still tucked away in her apron pocket, worn and creased from years of being carried around. It had become her talisman, a reminder of the power of believing in something better, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. As she sipped her tea, the bell over the door rang, and a young couple walked in, their cheeks flushed from the cold. They looked around, clearly uncertain but hopeful. Maggie smiled and waved them over. "Come on in," she said warmly. "We're still open." The couple exchanged a look, then sat down at one of the booths. They explained that they were new in town, looking for work, and didn't have much money but had heard about the diner from someone at the local shelter. Maggie listened, her heart aching at their story but also swelling with determination. She had been in their shoes, and she knew how much it meant to find someone willing to give you a chance. She brought them each a hot meal and refused their timid offers to pay with the few crumpled bills they had. As they ate, she thought about how far she had come since the days when she had been on the brink of losing everything. The diner had survived not because of luck, but because of the connection she had made and the kindness she had chosen to show, even when it wasn't easy. That night, after she had closed up and was tidying the counter, Maggie found herself thinking about the old man again. She wondered if he had any idea how much his simple note had changed her life, how much strength and hope it had given her. She didn't know where he was or if she would ever see him again, but she hoped, wherever he was, that he knew what he had done. The years continued to pass, and the diner became a cornerstone of the community. Maggie was no longer just the owner of a diner. She was a mentor, a friend, and to some, even a mother figure. People came to her not just for her food, but for her wisdom, her warmth, and the sense of hope she inspired. The diner wasn't just a business anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, kindness, and the idea that no matter how tough things got, there was always a way forward. One sunny afternoon, as Maggie was wiping down the counter, she noticed a man standing outside the diner, looking in through the window. He was older now, his back slightly hunched, and his hair a little grayer, but there was no mistaking him. It was the old man. Her heart leapt in her chest as he pushed open the door and stepped inside, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Well, I'll be," he said with a grin. "Looks like you made it." Maggie couldn't stop the tears from streaming down her face as she walked around the counter and embraced him. "I did," she whispered. "Thanks to you." The old man sat at the counter, and Maggie poured him a cup of coffee, just like she had all those years ago. They talked for hours, sharing stories of what had happened in their lives since that day. He told her that he had been passing through town back then, searching for purpose after losing everything. Her kindness had reminded him that there was still good in the world, and it had given him the strength to start over. As they sat together, Maggie realized something she had always known deep down: kindness was never wasted. It had a way of coming back, often when you least expected it. And in that moment, surrounded by the familiar hum of the diner and the presence of the man who had changed her life, Maggie felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for him, but for every struggle, every challenge, and every small act of kindness that had led her to this moment. The old man's name was Walter, and as they sat together in the diner that afternoon, Maggie learned more about him than she had ever expected. He had once been a schoolteacher, a man who had devoted his life to helping others learn and grow. But life had dealt him a cruel hand. After his wife passed away and his small savings were lost in a failed investment, Walter had found himself wandering from town to town, searching for meaning in the remnants of his life. "I didn't have much to give back then," Walter said, his voice soft but steady. "But when I sat here at your counter and saw the way you treated me, with dignity, without pity, It reminded me of who I was. It reminded me that there's still good in the world, even when it feels like everything's falling apart. Maggie listened intently, her heart swelling with emotion. You don't know how much that note meant to me, Walter. I was barely hanging on. That day, I felt like I was about to lose everything. Your words gave me hope. Walter smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Funny how that works, isn't it? A little hope can change everything. Sometimes, all it takes is a spark to get the fire going again. As the afternoon turned into evening, the diner began to fill up with its usual crowd. People greeted Maggie warmly, many of them pausing to chat or share a laugh before finding their seats. Walter watched it all with quiet admiration, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "You built something special here," he said. "This isn't just a diner, Maggie. It's a community." Maggie nodded, her gaze sweeping over the familiar faces of her customers, people who had come to rely on the diner not just for food, but for the sense of belonging it provided. "It wasn't always like this," she admitted. "It took time, and there were moments when I wanted to give up. But I couldn't. Not after what you wrote to me." Walter reached across the counter and placed a hand on hers. "You didn't just save this diner, Maggie. You saved yourself. And in doing that, you saved all of this. These people, they need you as much as you need them." The words settled deep in Maggie's heart, and for a moment, she was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had both been through. Two strangers who had crossed paths at their lowest points, only to find strength and purpose through each other. Over the next few days, Walter became a fixture in the diner. He would come in each morning for a cup of coffee and a slice of pie, sitting at the counter and chatting with Maggie as she worked. Customers took notice of him, drawn to his gentle demeanor and the quiet wisdom he seemed to carry. Soon, Walter became a part of the community, sharing stories of his teaching days and offering advice to anyone who asked. It wasn't long before Maggie found a way to bring Walter into the diner's operations. He had mentioned that he missed teaching, so she suggested he start a coffee and conversation hour at the diner, a time when people could come in to talk, share ideas, and learn from one another. Walter was hesitant at first, but Maggie's enthusiasm was contagious, and soon the idea became a reality. The first coffee and conversation session was a modest success. A handful of people showed up, curious about what Walter had to offer. But as word spread, more and more people began to attend, eager to hear his stories and participate in the discussions. The diner buzzed with energy during those hours, and Maggie couldn't help but smile as she watched Walter come alive in his element. One day, as she cleared tables after a particularly lively session, Walter approached her with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he began, "this diner isn't just a place to eat anymore. It's become something much bigger. You've created a space where people feel seen, where they feel like they matter." Maggie blushed, brushing off his words with a laugh. "I just wanted to keep the doors open. The rest sort of happened on its own." Walter shook his head, his tone turning serious. "No, May, you made this happen. It's your heart, your kindness, that brought these people together." Maggie looked around the diner, taking in the laughter and conversation that filled the air. Walter was right. This was more than a diner now. It was a place of hope, a place where people came to find connection and solace. And it all started with a single act of kindness. Months turned into years, and the diner continued to thrive. Maggie expanded the menu, added more tables, and even hired a few extra employees to keep up with the growing demand. Walter's coffee and conversation sessions became a staple of the diner's weekly schedule, drawing people from neighboring towns who had heard about the unique little diner with a big heart. One day, Maggie found herself sitting in the back office, going through a stack of letters and notes she had received over the years. Many of them were from customers who had come to the diner during tough times and wanted to thank her for the kindness she had shown them. As she read through the heartfelt messages, she couldn't help but think of Walter's note, the one that had started it all. She pulled it out from its special place in her desk drawer, her fingers tracing the familiar creases. The words still held the same power they had the day she first read them, reminding her of how far she had come and how much one small act of kindness could change a life. Later that evening, as the diner bustled with its usual crowd, Maggie stood behind the counter, watching the scene unfold. Walter was sitting at his usual spot, chatting with a group of regulars. Claire, now one of Maggie's most trusted employees, was taking orders with a confidence that had once seemed impossible. The young couple who had come in during the winter now had steady jobs and often brought their baby with them, their laughter filling the air. Maggie smiled, her heart full as she realized the truth she had learned through it all. Kindness was contagious. It didn't just change one life. It created ripples, spreading out and touching countless others in ways you might never see. She may never have expected it, but the diner had become her legacy, a living testament to the power of hope, resilience, and the belief that even in the hardest of times, something good could always come your way. And as Maggie served another customer with a warm smile and a plate of food, she knew she would carry that lesson with her for the rest of her days. As the seasons turned and the years continued to roll by, the diner's reputation grew beyond the small town. Travelers passing through began to hear whispers about a little diner with a big heart, a place where the food was comforting, the people were welcoming, and the sense of community was like nothing else. Articles were written in local papers, and eventually, a regional magazine featured Maggie's diner in a piece about small-town treasures. Maggie laughed when she saw her photo in the article, standing behind the counter with Walter and Claire on either side of her. The tension felt surreal, but she was grateful for it all the same. With the newfound recognition, Maggie made a decision she had been considering for some time. She used the extra income from the influx of customers to give back even more. She started offering free meals once a month for anyone who needed them, no questions asked. She called it Community Night, and it quickly became one of the most anticipated events in town. People who could afford to pay often left extra money in the tip jar or donated directly to help cover the cost, and Maggie marveled at how the spirit of generosity seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Walter played a key role in these nights, greeting people at the door and ensuring that everyone felt welcome. He had a way of making people feel at ease, and Maggie often overheard him sharing his wisdom with those who needed it most. His presence had become an anchor for the diner, just as much as Maggie's. One particularly busy community night, Maggie found herself standing back and watching the scene unfold. The diner was packed, with people of all ages and backgrounds coming together to share a meal. Laughter and conversation filled the air, and the scent of roasted chicken and warm bread wafted from the kitchen. Walter was at the counter, chatting with a group of teenagers who had started attending his coffee and conversation sessions. Claire was bustling between tables, her energy contagious as she made sure everyone had what they needed. Maggie felt a lump in her throat as she took it all in. The diner had become so much more than she had ever dreamed. It wasn't just a place to eat. It was a place where people healed, grew, and connected. She thought about the hard times, the nights when she had cried herself to sleep, wondering how she would keep the lights on. Those days felt so distant now, like a memory from another life. As the night wound down and the last of the guests began to leave, Walter approached Maggie with a mischievous grin. "Got a surprise for you," he said, pulling a small envelope from his pocket. Maggie raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's this?" "Open it and find out," he said, his grin widening. Inside the envelope was a ticket to a local community event, a recognition ceremony for people who had made a significant impact in their towns. Maggie's name was on the invitation, listed as one of the honorees. Her jaw dropped, and she looked up at Walter in disbelief. "You nominated me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Walter shrugged, his eyes twinkling. "You deserve it. More than anyone I know." Tears pricked Maggie's eyes as she hugged him tightly. "I don't know what to say." "Just say you'll go," Walter replied. "You've given so much to this community, Maggie. It's about time people celebrated you." The ceremony was held a few weeks later, and Maggie attended with Walter, Claire, and a handful of regulars who insisted on coming to cheer her on. Standing on the small stage in front of a room full of people, Maggie felt a mixture of pride and humility. As she accepted the award, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the lowest point in her life to this moment of recognition. She took a deep breath and addressed the crowd. "This diner isn't just mine," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside her. "It belongs to all of us." Every person who walked through those doors and shared a meal, a story, or a moment of kindness helped build it into what it is today. I've learned that no matter how hard life gets, there's always a way forward if we lean on each other. So thank you for believing in me and for showing me the power of community. The applause was deafening, and as Maggie stepped down from the stage, she felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond anything she had ever experienced. The diner had given her a purpose, but it had also given her a family, one she hadn't known she needed. Back at the diner the next day, life returned to its usual rhythm. Maggie hung the award on the wall near the register, where everyone could see it. It wasn't just a reminder of her hard work. It was a symbol of what they had all built together. Walter continued to host his sessions, and Maggie noticed how people leaned on him just as much as they did on her. Claire started taking on more responsibility, hinting that she might want to manage the diner someday. Maggie encouraged her, knowing that the diner's future would be in good hands. As the years rolled on, Maggie found herself reflecting more often on the old man who had first walked into her diner all those years ago. She still carried his note, now carefully preserved in a small frame on her desk. Whenever she felt overwhelmed or uncertain, she would read his words and remember the moment that had changed everything. One sunny morning, as Maggie was pouring coffee for a table of regulars, a man and his young daughter walked into the diner. Maggie glanced up, her smile widening as she recognized the man. It was a traveler who had once come in with his wife during the winter years ago. His little girl looked around in awe, her eyes lighting up as she spotted the photos on the wall. "Welcome back," Maggie said warmly. "It's been a while." The man smiled, his face filled with gratitude. "We wanted to stop by and say thank you. You gave us more than a meal that night. You gave us hope. And now we're doing just fine." Maggie's heart swelled as she looked at the little girl, who grinned up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Your mama and papa are good people," Maggie said softly. The man nodded. "We'll never forget what you did for us." As they sat down to eat, Maggie returned to her place behind the counter, where Walter was already sipping his coffee and reading the morning paper. He glanced up at her and gave her a knowing smile. "See," he said, "what did I tell you? Kindness always comes back around." Maggie smiled back, her heart full. The diner, her life, and her purpose had all been shaped by one simple truth. Even the smallest act of kindness could spark a change that echoed far beyond what anyone could imagine. And as she went about her day, serving meals, sharing stories, and connecting with her community, Maggie knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. And so Maggie's life was forever changed by one small act of kindness. But what about you? Have you ever experienced a moment where a stranger's words or actions shifted your path? What impact could your own acts of kindness have on someone else's life? If this story made you think, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire and remind us of the power of human connection. What story should we tell next? Let us know below.